Welcome to Measuring Up. My name is Hamid from Radian Partners, and Measuring Up is a video series sponsored by the Institute for Public Relations Measurement Commission. And the series is all about public relations, communication, and the future of measurement and evaluation. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Tina McCorkindale, the President and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. And we've got some interesting topics to talk about. This is the first episode after the direction of the country has been changed a little bit. So we're excited to chat with Tina. Tina, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mo. Happy to be here.
Glad to have you. So Tina, I know we've got lots of interesting topics to sort of unravel here. Why don't we start, with a little bit of your background, because you've had a really interesting set of experiences professionally speaking, from academia to media analysis firms like Cision, and of course now the Institute. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so I always wanted, I think in my life, I always wanted to be a lawyer. And then I don't know, I just never got my act together. So I think everything that happened in my life was pretty serendipitous. It wasn't that I had this great goal and set out, this is what I wanted to be, but it just sort of happened. But when I was older, I wanted to be a college professor, which takes a lot of education. And so I did go get my PhD and then started as a college professor in California, then in North Carolina. And I've always taught at other places along the way. But then when I was getting my, I was a tenured professor at the last university where I taught. And I had always done these on and off projects with Michelle Vangel, who she went from being she was at like Symphony, and then she went to Visible Technologies. And so I just kind of went where Michelle went. And I was a contractor and just doing this extra work and measurement and doing, which has, by the way, come a long way in 20 years since I started doing that. But then when she was at Visible, I started taking on clients, and I had to do a report for one client like every morning at 5 a.m. And so then I was working just as much as I was in my and my professor job with a full-time job. So I had basically two full-time jobs. And I think that experience, and in addition to just being very active and volunteering a lot in the profession, took me to, I was on the board of IPR. I was one of the 5 academic board members. And then when the position of CEO came open, I applied for it and got it. So, and then here I've been in IPR about 5.5 years as CEO. So it's been a great journey.
Wow. And Tina, obviously, given that you've taken a unique path, there must be some insights and some learnings about career paths in particular in the world of PR and communications that you've come to know over the years. So maybe share a little bit about these different career paths and what you've learned about perhaps some uncommon paths that might be available that would be good for every aspiring practitioner to know.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we perceive to be PR, if we're not in the industry or don't work with PR people, comes from the media. And so, but there's so many different aspects of work that we can consider public relations, which is technically building relationships with audiences, both internal and external. So if you think about it, but we have this vision of the Olivia Popes or whoever's out there doing PR to save crises, and they're always swooping in and having, or they're trying to do something under the table to try to get their message out, or with clients. And so, or it's like Sex in the City. So I think people have these perceptions that a lot of PR is event management, crisis management, some things that are unethical. And I think for that, and for people who are getting into the profession, what they need to know is that there's so many things that what touch PR. It could be investor relations. It could be what I did as a research analyst. It could be being a professor. It could be anything in nonprofits. I mean, a lot of what nonprofit work is PR. And besides the corporate, it could also be working for associations, headhunters. So it definitely is, I think, one of the the breadth of PR professionals is pretty wide. And even what we've seen coming up is that people in other disciplines coming into PR. So increasing behavioral science and PR by hiring psychologists or anthropologists. And also I think the most important part is the strategy, like someone having about thinking about PR being more strategic and not as tactical. Not as tactical as like, let's put some post on social media page, but being really strategic and also thinking about how that works with the overall company strategy.
Mm-hmm. So in your view, Tina, which aspect of public relations and communications has evolved the most over the years, and why do you think that is?
Oh gosh, that's a really good question. What has evolved over the most? I'll definitely say, and it's a pretty expected cliche answer. It's definitely the social media outreach components and being more publicly out there. I think those two, because social media is a channel, but we did a recent survey with University of Florida and Radian Communications that found it to be more strategic, that it is a strategic function within. We've seen that evolve from even 12 years ago, when a lot of the organization channels on Facebook were merely employees like having fun fan channels, versus companies putting investment and time and resources into it. So I think that's been a big evolution. But also I think that the activism aspect of PR, meaning that companies are getting involved in issues that they typically have never been involved in or publicly speak about, that may or may not be directly related to their business. So I think that has evolved. And as we see with the changing generations and demographics in society, that will continue to play out. And that the speaking out part involves more strategy. And I think that's pretty key.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Tina, this is the Measuring Up series, so I'll ask a measurement question here. It's sort of a continuation of the question I just asked about the evolutions in PR and comms. So, as it pertains to communications and measurement, in your view, what has been the biggest innovation or perhaps new thinking over the past several years?
So I think what I've seen more is people tying to behavioral outcomes, right? I think that's been a bigger evolution, where you can track what people do online to where they end up at the end of it. I've seen that as the biggest evolution. I'll say that I don't think the measurement community is as evolved as it should be. And I say that as someone who's been part of that community for a long time. I think we focus way too much on media placements, and that's partly because the clients focus a lot on media placements. But I think there's so much we can do with measurement in terms of even like behavioral science, testing messages, even going to doing just more surveys and more like sophisticated analytics, predictive analytics. I would like to see more of that. And I still think people have some wonky definitions that doesn't make it valid. Their sort of measures valid. Very similarly to the way that the polls with the recent election were very skewed and off as well, because it wasn't valid. If the sample's not valid and you're not getting it, then it's not going to turn out the way you want it to.
As the old saying goes, right? Garbage in, garbage out, so to speak. Um, so Tina, one of the most interesting parts of your perspective, I think, is your role with IPR. It comes with a unique set of objectives and challenges and nuances. Um, so let's talk a little bit about that for perhaps those in the broader IPR community that may not be as familiar. Can you talk a little bit about the mission and the vision of the organization, and given your role over the past handful of years or so, uh, maybe something that surprised you about the PR community, or just in your role as president and CEO, that you didn't necessarily expect going into the role?
Yeah, so I say, so IPR, we're a nonprofit research organization, and that's our focus, is research that matters to the profession, and really trying to curate, develop, sponsor, produce insights that help professionals do their job. And we're independent, bipartisan. And we do that through our commissions and centers of excellence, which our measurement commission is one of our longest running, and sort of the reason why we're all here today. So that's sort of what we do as an organization, and we try to release studies, and we have a great weekly research letter that we put out. So that's our primary focus. And then what was the second part, Mo?
Just what has perhaps surprised you?
Surprised me, yes. I'll say that what surprised me is that there's still a lot of organizations who don't necessarily adopt research. This still surprises me. It's because, even when in some of the work that we do, and we get a lot of anonymous feedback from surveys, but some of that still surprises me. And, for example, in some of the comments that we get in some of the studies, we always ask for additional comments. And some people, when we ask them, how are you measuring your audience, and how are you measuring feedback from your employees? They'll say something like, well, we read their emails. We read the emails they sent us. And you're like, wait, what? Like, that's terrible. You have this great audience of employees that you can draw, random samples from at certain periods of time to check in on them. And I think that still surprises me. That the measurement piece, I think, still surprises me. But but what doesn't surprise me is there are a lot of smart people in our profession. And I have a really smart board of trustees, and they're really, I think a lot of them are really making a difference in society based on the work that they do in their organizations. And I think a lot of times people are really down on corporations and big business, but they really are what makes things happen. And a lot of the privileges we get in society are from the companies, whether it's the communities they're based in or the work they're doing to try to help the environment, or getting people to vote. I mean, that's a perfect example, the time to vote and how many companies adopted it. I mean, that was a corporate push. So I think that has surprised me as well. But for, IPR, we've grown a lot over the past 5 years, I think, and I'm hoping we'll continue that upward trajectory. I hope so I can keep my job.
Absolutely. I'll just add my own perspective very briefly here. One of my observations, sort of in line with what you described, Tina, is that relative to a lot of other functional areas, at least in the corporate world, the ratio of dissenting to non-dissenting opinions is really interesting in this profession relative to others. So when I compare PR or comms to, let's say, an engineering or a finance or even an HR like function, the perhaps most startling thing to acclimate to was how there's widespread disagreement about almost everything and anything. Whether it's about how to formulate a PR and comm strategy, how to measure it, how to improve it, how to calibrate it. This is not necessarily a domain with a ton of consensus relative to other domains, and that I think brings about many unique challenges. So it's an interesting ecosystem and interesting world. Tina, to follow up on what you described with respect to the mission and the vision of the Institute, I know, and I'm sure our audience can imagine as well, that the COVID circumstances have changed things quite a bit for IPR. So for our audience, can you talk a little bit about how the COVID environment has perhaps influenced the roadmap for IPR, how it's changed the way in which IPR needs to go about pursuing its mission, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think the last trip I took, I was on a plane, March, like second week of March. I remember the last trip was to Orlando, and it was the day before they shut down Disney World. And it was just a quick in and out. I was there, I got there late in the evening, then I left the next afternoon. So very fast turnaround. And I live on the West Coast. So, but I remember when we got back, we had a conference slated, excuse me, in person for the end of March. And it was actually it was right before I went to Orlando, but we were thinking like, okay, do we hold this in person? How are we doing it? Because no one had called their conferences yet. Everyone was still on the books. Everyone was still happening. And then I remember I was sitting in the airport, like waiting to leave to go home in the Orlando airport. And I was like, we have to call this conference. Like, I know it's 3 weeks out, but there's just no way. And I'm still live in Seattle. And so that was sort of the hotbed and the center. And we were just worried about how it's going to progress. And we were seeing cases climb in DC. So we were like one of the first to cancel conference. And so we canceled it, which of course was a smart decision. And then we moved it to November thinking we would fine in person. And we just had it last week virtually, of course. And then our 2021 conference we scheduled for September in DC. But I mean, gosh, who even knows? We're planning on holding it in person, but who knows what will happen in September then. But, for us, we have a small team and it's a really smart team, quick team. We don't get mired in processes. So we quickly pivoted to COVID research and featuring just COVID in our research letter, because we met as a team and said, you know what, no one's going to talk about anything else but COVID. We have this great study that we had a survey that was ready to launch. We had our disinformation study and we had to put it on hold because even if we did launch it, no one's going to read it. They're so COVID focused right now. So everything we did at that point was COVID. And we partnered with Peppercom on 3 studies. We partnered on a study with Leger. We partnered on a study with Harris Poll. And then we started summarizing research, and we changed the whole layout of our research letter to summarize more and to be more proactive, which will stay with us. That's one of the good things that has resulted from this. But then we did that until we saw a window where there was either fatigue on COVID or that people they were sort of going back to some as normal business. And I don't mean that as they're going back to work and stuff, but they were focusing on other things. So when that hit, that's when we started doing more research and publishing some of the research that we had put on hold. But we did an ebook as well. And but I think COVID has taught us that we can pivot very fast and we can make sort of big decisions about what happens to IPR, but it's all based on what our mission is. And that's what research do people need right now to do their jobs. And so that's sort of the focus that we've gone with.
Thanks for sharing that perspective, Tina. And I, for one, just want to commend you on the way in which you've just sort of pivoted with respect to COVID. I think we've obviously been seeing a wide range of virtual events and sort of an increasing cadence of content, et cetera. And at least from my perspective, the IPR community is more vibrant and thriving than ever before. So I commend you on that. And Tina, as we wrap up our discussion today, one thing that sort of is the elephant in the room, I definitely want to get your perspective on. Obviously, there's sort of a shift that is currently underway with respect to politics, driven by President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. And many, of course, have spoken about how the Trump administration had an impact on media relations, just given the way that the president sort of illustrated his relationship with the press, and how that further influenced the way in which PR practitioners navigated that environment. So, do you think that this new administration will have an impact on PR and this ongoing dialogue that we have in the industry about disinformation, misinformation, fake news, etc.?
Yeah, so that's a great question. IPR is nonpartisan, but I definitely have a strong opinion about it. It's really good for us. It's really good for us moving forward that we do have a new president. I think President Trump was extremely damaging to us as a profession, partly for the disinformation and misinformation, but it also put communicators at risk. So when he was elected, We published a study a couple months later that looked at what people perceive to be a new presidential administration and how you deal with it. And there was a lot of, at the time, uncertainty. People had perceived risk. He was very unpredictable. They weren't really sure what was going to happen. And with a Biden administration, I mean, and people differ whether Biden's the best candidate, but with a Biden administration, it'll be more predictable, and there will be more confidence, less uncertainty, and also internationally, which we haven't really talked about as much. And I know a lot of leaders congratulated, and I also think you have to think who you align with. So certain countries that were unhappy or trying to push for a Trump presidency are not necessarily the ones that we want to closely affiliate with. But for international companies and multinational companies, a Biden presidency is so much stronger. Even if you think about the visas, right? Like putting restrictions on visas and people being able to come into the country. I mean, not based on any safety or anything else, but based more on your dislike for certain groups. I mean, that creates some big problems for companies and their ability to get their work done. So I think definitely what we will see is less. Well, here's the other concern, Mo, is that you see some social media, these rogue social media platforms popping up because they don't like Parler, because they don't like the censorship on Facebook and Twitter. So that's the only challenge, is that now you're going to see people moving to platforms that only agree with their perspective, and we're already complaining that we live in a bubble. And for the 5 million people fewer who voted for Trump, we still have to remember that a sizable chunk of the country still voted for Trump, and that has implications as well. Clearly, we're polarized, we're divided, and there's all going to be a lot of work to do for communicators moving forward and trying to bridge the gap, and also work on social issues that have been affected during the Trump presidency, like Black Lives Matter, which was directly related to a Trump presidency. So yeah.
Thank you, Tina, for sharing that perspective. I, for one, I think everything that's going on right now will result in a more favorable environment for communicators, and I'm excited about the work that you and the team continue to do at IPR. So thank you again for that. I know, I, for one, have really benefited with with all the extra time I've had sitting at home, benefiting from the content that IPR has been putting out, the virtual conferences. We just did the Bridge conference, which was very successful, etc. So thank you again to you and the team for your work. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, and I also have to shout out, I've been very lucky in my time at IPR to work with just two amazing chairs. Linda Rutherford was the past chair at Southwest Airlines, and Steve Cody's the current chair. And they were just fantastic to work with. So Steve and I text all the time, and, we'll throw ideas off each other. And he's like, when we pivoted to COVID, it was very easy. He wasn't like, let's just see what happens. He's like, you're exactly right. Let's go for it. Let's do this. And, I think that makes a big difference as well, is to have, strong chairs in the position who really care a lot. And I've been really fortunate to see that during my time at IPR.
Couldn't agree more. And with that, Tina, I think that that'll do it for this episode. Thanks again for dedicating some time to this conversation. Really, really interesting insights. And for our IPR community, we're doing this just about every other week. So we'll be back to you very soon. And if you have any questions or comments with respect to this conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you soon.